Welcome back to This Is Your Country with Paige Willey. This is the final episode of This Is Your Country before I place the show on indefinite hiatus to work on something new. And I want to thank my tens of thousands of listeners. I'm really proud of the deep dives on issues facing our country that we've done on the show. I'm so grateful to all of our fellow citizens who want to stay focused on the substantial levers by which we can fix the dysfunction and end the extraction, because this is your country. Now, before I get into today's episode, where I'll talk a little bit about what the Republicans' governing agenda should be now that they have a thin majority in the House and how they should present their priorities to the American public, I also want to thank all of my great guests who have joined the show for interviews. I hope that you have enjoyed them. I hope that you found them informative, because we had some really exceptional experts who are illuminating facets of these problems facing the nation that often are, perspectives that you don't get on the mainstream media channels, simply because there is so much invested in protecting the dysfunction, protecting the status quo, that one of my main priorities on This Is Your Country was finding people who can help the public understand what the stakes are, understand how we can fix some of these issues, and understand the most crucial data points that we need to stay focused on as metrics of how the country is doing, how our citizens are doing, and so on. You can stay up to date with me on Twitter at Midwesterner with an EUR at the end, and keep an eye out for what comes next. So, moving right along, I also want to reflect a little bit on some of the most important topics we addressed on the show over the past year. So, some of the most popular episodes actually had to do with trade and globalization. And I was happy to see this, because obviously trade and globalism are key issues of my personal interest. I grew up in the Midwest and saw personally firsthand how these quote unquote free trade deals, how reducing tariffs basically to nothing, how making these arrangements with other countries where our industrial capacity was bartered away for the price of lunch, how these policy changes in Washington were incredibly destructive to enormous regions of the country, to enormous swaths of our American citizens, and of course to our capacity to defend ourselves, both in terms of our ability to create technologies that would give us a leg up in all kinds of industries relative to China, Korea, Japan, Germany, and so on, but also even in things like military equipment. And at one point, there was the threat of the last factory in America making tanks shutting down and being moved overseas. And that was something that President Trump was particularly attentive to right after he took office. So I was particularly delighted to see that this was a topic that resonated with my listeners, because it's a question that many in the mainstream, whether they are academics, economists, politicians, you name it, they act as though the trade and manufacturing and globalization questions had been totally settled for decades, and that any person questioning the conventional wisdom on these issues was some type of fringe lunatic who was pining for a vision of America that no longer existed and could no longer be possible and wasn't even desirable. But that is the key thing that we do on the show, is that we question the conventional wisdom that is hurting our country and hurting its people. So the episode that actually did the best over the past year was How Globalization Ate the American Economy, featuring Clyde Prestowitz. Now, that was actually the first interview I did on the show. He was an exceptional expert on the history of how we got to this point where we became so weakened by the offshoring of our factories, the mindset that our leaders were in when they were doing these things that were portrayed to the public as so virtuous and so fabulous, helping, China's economy come online, helping these countries build up their industrial bases after World War II. But the fact is that we did not do this in a smart way. We should have stopped these low tariff, pro-globalization policies when it became clear that we were helping to enrich foreign adversaries beyond a point that was wise or helpful to our country. And even if corporate interests were enjoying, these open markets selling their things to other countries, lowering their production costs by moving their industry to nations where there are no labor or environmental standards. It was clearly coming at an enormous cost to our country. And yet there is this big entrenched effort to portray it as though it had no downsides. Now, of course, we saw that the other side of that coin was that eventually we elected President Trump, who was one of the only politicians to take that seriously and take that message to the entire nation and work to address those problems. And then my second most popular episode was Real Independence, where I just went through how these trade policies that protected American industry, protected American manufacturers and business people, those were priorities of the founding fathers going back to the original days of our nation when it was being formed, when it was clear to them that a new nation could not survive and do well and provide for its citizens unless you took your manufacturing base very, very seriously, protected it, and built it up. So I just think it's interesting that there is still such a robust audience for understanding how our country became such a successful nation with these pro-American trade and manufacturing policies from its earliest days. And now this doctrine of globalization is really such a recent development, and its downsides have been so catastrophic: slower growth, loss of employment, loss of wages, stagnation of wages, even the ushering in of the horrific opioid epidemic that was killing people all across Appalachia and the industrial Midwest. This has been a really destructive economic trend for our nation, and any person who questions it is beaten down by the people who are enriching themselves off of it. So now this actually dovetails into the rest of what I want to discuss in this episode, which is what should be on the agenda when the Republican Party communicates with the American public over the next 2 years. How do we reposition ourselves, rise from the ashes, the humiliations of the past several years where we've been losing to the Biden administration, constantly participating in these catastrophic pieces of legislation in Congress that are billed to the public as bipartisan, but they're simply uncontrolled graft and spending that enrich special interest lobbyists. All of these things that the GOP continues to do while it's base voters and the winnable independents that you need to have a winning coalition in elections, while their priorities, their voices go ignored, and they're continually beaten down, impoverished, and disenfranchised by the one-party rule in Washington under Biden and the Democrats who are controlling both branches of Congress. So now that we have the opportunity, it is so crucial to differentiate ourselves, and I'm going to return to a piece that I wrote just about a year ago called No Country for Bold Men, where I warned about the risks of becoming too complacent and non-committal as a party that was challenging the incumbents. And the problem is there were so many operatives and consultants and politicians and special interests with a huge amount of influence in Washington who were encouraging the party and its candidates to commit to nothing, to speak in generalities and platitudes about how Biden was doing bad things, but never committing to the ideal outcomes or the ways that they were going to fix these problems for the public. And this is something that I have identified for a very long time, which is that President Trump was successful in many, many ways because when he was campaigning in 2016, he was offering the American public a different end state, a different ideal of what he was aiming for our country to be like. He was talking about the urgent need to reorient our trade policy to fix these deals where we were not protecting our industry, we were not protecting our jobs, we were not protecting our pride in making things in this nation, we were not protecting our citizens from illegal immigration, we were not protecting our citizens from the infringement on our sovereignty in these international organizations where we were being taken advantage of. And we were not protecting our country's interests in these entrenched foreign conflicts. So he was doing something innovative and unusual as a Republican candidate, which is talk about his ideal outcomes. And I really as I tick through some of these agenda items, that is the one thing that I would really like to get Republican elected officials focused on, is to talk about the outcome that you want for the American people. Now, as I wrote in this essay, No Country for Bold Men, the Washington apparatus on the GOP side is vehement when they advise candidates do not commit to anything, because they want to keep the legislative agenda open for lobbyists and special interests to write the legislation they want. Rather than promising anything to the American people, they want to hold the pen. They want to write the regulations. They want to write the handouts. They want to write the legislation with complete control so that they are the ones enriching themselves, and there's no chance that voters will get their voices heard and get some small piece of policy time and attention focused on what they need delivered for them by their representatives. It is a total distortion of how policymaking is supposed to work, how it was intended to work, and how it can work if we are going to have a successful nation that delivers positive outcomes for its people. So I'm just going to go through a list of some policy ideas where if I could wave a magic wand and get the GOP to focus on things that would improve their popularity, improve their ability to deliver positive outcomes for the American public, and improve their standing at winning elections, this is what I would focus on. And you can already see that some of these are have a lot of juice to them, because the Democrats, you can see Joe Biden is already trying to pivot a little bit to acting as if he's going to be tough on China, as if he's going to focus on quote unquote making things in America. This is actually something that I addressed in another one of my most popular episodes about trade and industry, which was the America Last establishment attempts to co-opt MAGA rhetoric. And this was all about how Washington recognized that the American public is becoming more hostile and impatient with the leverage that China has over our country. After COVID, after these supply chain problems, after watching China ship all of these components, the chemical components of fentanyl, directly to the cartels in Mexico, where they traffic it up here and kill our citizens to the tune of 100,000 every year. The American public is very, very, very frustrated with the capture that China has over our economy and over our nation, and even over our culture, with things like TikTok and other forms of other channels of propaganda that are that enables them to reach our citizens' data, and so on. And so Washington, D.C., they know that they should do something about this, but they can't do too much because many of them are still enriching themselves off of our nation's dependence on China, whether it's making things there or these other relationships such as everyone knows, the NBA, Hollywood, these other entities that they make these sort of deals with the devil where they do whatever China wants because they want access to China's market. I remember my guest, Clyde Prestowitz, said that in Washington, D.C., Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, is a powerful guy, but in China, he's on his knees. He has no leverage there. They know that he needs that market access and that he needs access to building his product in their country. So again, it's amazing to me that the downsides of globalization are still not properly discussed, properly understood by our leaders, when the public can see them so clearly and they're suffering for those reasons. And even the coupling of our financial markets with how these other countries are doing, tremendous risks every way you slice it. And so, as I say, people in Washington know that they should be addressing this because they know it's popular. They know that the first party, the first faction that can appear to be responsive to the public's concerns about this China issue, they stand to gain quite a bit. But the problem is you have people like Biden who say that they're going to talk tough to Xi Jinping and they're going to make it in America. He's got all his digital staffers tweeting stuff like that all the time. But when you look at their actions, they don't back up the words. So the China issue still is it's a completely open field for any person with their head screwed on straight in Washington to lead on this topic. So I'll just give a couple examples. Number one, when we started addressing the semiconductor, the chips issue with the CHIPS Act, everyone in Washington and the media was pretending that this was some fabulous, amazing step towards fixing our country's industrial capacity and solving this issue. Mostly what it was, and it was some element of positive progress, but mostly what the CHIPS Act was a handout to highly lobbied up industries so that they could get some taxpayer money to build factories in this country. Now, we definitely need to be building factories and making things like chips in our country. However, I was stunned when I saw that something like the CHIPS Act was not accompanied by very vigorous incentives and policies to, number one, educate American citizens so that they have a solid pipeline into those high-tech jobs when we pay companies with taxpayer money to build these types of factories here. And instead, to my dismay, I saw the high-tech lobbies come out saying that now that we were going to build factories here, we needed to open up the immigration system and provide many more guest worker visas to other countries' citizens to come fill those high-skilled jobs. My jaw was on the floor when I saw that. It is shocking. It's disgusting. When our taxpayer money is going to help private companies build up their business in this nation, it should be accompanied by similar efforts to invest in our own domestic workforce, to invest in the opportunities for our fellow citizens to have meaningful jobs. So that was a big oversight. It was a big lost opportunity in my mind. Can you imagine that once we had the CHIPS Act going, which is, as I say, it's a positive thing, the Republican Party should have come out and said, the most important thing we can do next is make sure that these good-paying, high-tech, high-skilled jobs go to the American people instead of other countries' citizens. Why didn't they do that? Who owns them? Why couldn't they have come out and made a positive engagement on this issue, popularized it with the public, and then forced the Democrats to be the party of the lobbyists, saying, no, those jobs shouldn't go to the American public. This is the lack of strategic thinking that is catastrophic to our party. It's hurting our chances with voters. And worse than being the party of no, as many Republican politicians like to call us when they're criticized for assisting in corrupt bipartisan graft bills, is being the party of nothingness. Standing for nothing, having no ideas, trying to smooth over your failure to deliver for the public with meaningless platitudes right before the election, as if you snapped out of a 100-year sleep and remembered that you have an obligation to appeal to the public, to win voters over, and to deliver to them when you are elected. So this mindset as the party of nothingness is becoming really, really, really damaging, if not fatal, to the GOP. And I just simply tell that anecdote about the CHIPS Act, and then even this one where the day before the election in 2022, you had some members of Congress saying that we need to peel off the Trump tariffs that were squeezing China, and actually were becoming very successful at bringing manufacturing employment back to the United States. This is what they were looking at and saying, you know what we need to do if Republicans have control in Congress is remove the tariffs that are working exactly as intended and strengthening our country and weakening China. I was in disbelief when I saw that the day before the election. And this is the type of fecklessness that is really, really hurting us with the public. I also raise this as an important approach for the party to take because the Democrats have a strategy that they call popularism, where it was actually started by an old advisor to Barack Obama from some of his campaigns, who is known as this sort of data whiz for the Democratic Party. And he's become kind of an unpopular figure in the Biden era because he's been critical of Biden and his sort of deep bench of Soros advisors. because they have dispensed with any notion that they need to be appealing to the public at all. They've just come out and basically said, we are going to beat you down with a series of policies designed to disenfranchise the middle class and impoverish anyone who doesn't vote for us. You're supposed to furnish the tax base for our utopian ideals and our ideological experiments, but you're really not going to get any more representation in Congress or in the country overall. We want to make Puerto Rico and DC states so that you never have representation in the Senate. We're going to eliminate the filibuster so that you never have representation there. We want to pack the Supreme Court so that you don't have representation there. And we're going to flood the country with other country citizens so that your money is spent on furnishing them with a better life instead of furnishing your fellow citizens with a better life. And we are going to completely demolish national sovereignty by ceding away our leverage in every conceivable instance when we are at the negotiating table with international organizations and foreign countries. So they will look you straight in the eye and tell the American citizens that that's what they want to do. Even you had Joe Biden's ambassador to the UN insisting that the United States was basically an irredeemable nation founded in sin that doesn't deserve any better because, as she said verbatim, the white supremacy was woven into the founding documents of the United States. So the Biden era has actually been a departure from what the Democrats usually do when they're trying to campaign and win over voter sentiment. Instead of coming up with euphemisms for what they want to do, which usually are things like climate justice and health equity, they'll still use those terms, but really they've been very bold and blatant about what that means, which is making many Americans second-class citizens in their own country while they continue to rearrange government to serve as basically a flow of patronage money to the people who they intend to buy off as reliable voter blocs. So they have been very open about that. And what we have now is that if Republicans do not embrace a strategy of coming up with popular policies that are genuinely oriented towards the national interest and committing to selling those policies to the public and delivering on them when they have power, they are going to get trounced by this Democrats' strategy of either disenfranchising and impoverishing any voter in the country who can vote them out, or by this more clever strategy of popularism, which sells the public a bill of goods by making their policies sound so nice and wonderful, but actually screwing the voter on the back end. So either way you have it, the Democrats are positioned fabulously to continue winning elections and continue screwing voters who have no recourse. But the Republicans have not really risen to the challenge or met the moment. And that is exactly what I was warning about with this essay, No Country for Bold Men, this time last year when I saw this complacency in DC, this insistence that they were going to cruise to re-election with a fabulous red wave, promising voters nothing. So the bad news is that we did not perform as well as we should have, given that given Biden's tremendous unpopularity with the public, given the referendum that they should have expected on such a failed incumbent who could not care less about the suffering that the public was enduring. And instead they failed. And so I think that many of the base voters were very, very worried about that. They've seen the party fail before. They've seen the party fumble when in these critical moments where they should have acted with strength and where they should have committed to delivering on popular issues for the public. So without further ado, I'm going to get into my list of agenda items that I wish the Republican Party would turn their attention to and commit to, no matter what the special interests, no matter what the lobbyists, and no matter what the media say about them or do to try and deprive American voters of a voice who really need people in Washington to stand up for the national interest and stand up for the welfare of our people. To begin with, the GOP needs a serious agenda on the subject of immigration, and this agenda needs to be resolutely focused on the issue of deportation. And this is a term that politicians have become terrified to utter, but the simple fact is, if you have any laws in your country governing immigration whatsoever, and people come into this country and break those laws, you are going to need to accompany those actions every time with deportation. That's what happens when you come to a country and break its laws as your first act on its soil. There is something really strange that governs the immigration policy discourse in Washington, D.C., which is that both Republicans and Democrats want to maximize the number of other countries' citizens who come and reside in the United States. And I have done some very deep dives on this issue before, whether it's why the business community likes illegal immigration because it suppresses wages, whether it's the far left activists who want to dilute American voters' representation, these activists who are now successful in many localities in ensuring that non-citizens can vote in local elections. Whether it's a historical example like Proposition 187 in the state of California, which I covered in the episode How the Government Deprives Voters of a Voice on Immigration, that was a notorious issue where there was so much illegal immigration to the state of California that their health system, their education system, their entitlement systems were all on the verge of collapsing because they could not finance what the demands illegal immigrants were making to these systems amounted to. So you had a referendum where California's voters decided that illegal aliens would no longer be eligible for these entitlements and for these public services. And then a federal judge decided that democratic outcome was an intolerable injustice and voided the results of that election. Any step that American voters take to have recourse over this policy that is causing enormous damage to the nation, to its communities that are impoverishing themselves to try and furnish the funds for hospitals, education, entitlements, you name it, the economic competition in many industries where Americans who are competing in that direct economic class, whether it's people with no high school diploma, people with no college degree, there is economic competition anytime that you increase the number of laborers coming to this nation and working in a specific field. So it has become very difficult for people who work in construction in America, people who work in landscaping, people across all of these industries where you have high flows of foreign labor coming to America. It is becoming nearly impossible for these people to make a living anymore because their wages are constantly depressed every time there's another huge wave of people coming into this country and working in those industries. If you believe in supply and demand, you have to believe that increasing the supply of workers in a certain field is going to depress the price of labor. That's what happens in Economics 101. Of course, a big problem with getting the GOP to address these downsides of unsustainable mass immigration is that they are so lobbied up by these businesses that want high volumes of labor, or they're connected, just like the left is, to these NGOs whose business model is when immigration is maximized, they get more contracts of government money to provide services for them. So at this point, it is incorrect to discuss immigration as a moral crusade to help people from other countries live a better life. And it is now an issue where you have perverse incentives to maximize the number of people coming to this country because entities are making money off of it. The more people who come here, the more money they make. And the problem here is that immigration policy has become so divorced from the interests of the American people that it is practically no longer a policy at this point. It is simply a way in which the government works with private interests to depress the price of labor, and it's accompanied by so many downsides that are never addressed, including making it impossible to manage these public services across cities, towns, and states. This is why you're seeing the mayor of New York, the mayor of DC, the mayor of Denver, all of the mayors of these towns trying to make it known that they can't possibly handle this influx of illegal immigrants coming from the southern border because it's a very, very, very expensive enterprise. You have millions and across the nation, billions being cannibalized from other parts of the budget that are supposed to be dedicated to the welfare of that city or that state's citizens, being siphoned away because Joe Biden wants to import other countries' citizens by the millions, if not tens of millions. It is so unjust and so immoral. And you have nothing, you have no activity from Congress interested in addressing this. Further, you have an issue that should be a great shame to our nation, which is that many of the unaccompanied migrants who come across the southern border are placed by a government entity, which is the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Refugee Resettlement. They are placed, remember, these are people under the age of 18. They are kids, children, teenagers who come across the southern border without their parents, and they are placed by the government with dubious quote-unquote sponsors claiming to be their relatives. Now, I did a very thorough deep dive into this phenomenon where I titled the episode The Biden Doctrine, Human Sacrifices for Open Borders, where I discovered that this is a routine occurrence, that they are placing children with people who are not their parents. And it makes you wonder, how do they even find these people? And oftentimes these illegal immigrant children are turning up working in meatpacking plants. They're working on poultry farms. They're living in squalid conditions in trailers and on concrete floors of greenhouses and sheds and garages. Something is deeply, deeply sick and wrong with whatever is happening with Biden incentivizing traffickers to bring children from other countries into the United States, and then taxpayers pay the Department of Health and Human Services to traffic those children the rest of the way to other parts of the country, where they're turning up working in meatpacking plants or being sexually abused or being exploited. And in many cases, this is completely unaddressed. I've seen no activity from Congress interested in resolving this medieval form of an indentured child servitude and exploitation and abuse. And we simply continue to pay our taxpayer dollars toward this disgusting experiment. And in addition to the failures of course, the Democrats are not interested in investigating this or resolving it because it would obviously portray the Biden administration in a catastrophically horrific light that they're enabling and continuing this. But the fact that the GOP could not be bothered to campaign or govern on this issue is just really disappointing. And this is what I mean about seizing opportunities where there is real sick dysfunction in this country. And the GOP could differentiate themselves from the sickos in the entrenched establishment who want to keep this all going. They could easily differentiate themselves and win elections by promising to make policies to fix this. And even if they are these highly lobbied up corporate globalization type Republican elected officials, you would think, since they're always virtue signaling about the issue of the Uyghurs in China, that in order to make sure that our nation has any leg to stand on in the international community when we're trying to hold it over China's head that they're dealing with these labor camps of Uyghurs in China, it completely undermines our nation's legitimacy to talk about that issue when we've got the president of the United States bringing other countries' children across our border so that they can wind up as cheap labor in meatpacking plants and exploited by sex traffickers. It is impossible to overstate how seriously the immigration issue is subverting our nation on every level, from the economy, jobs and wages, to our national standing and legitimacy when you've got the child labor issue I was just describing, the child exploitation problem that HHS is facilitating with our own taxpayer money. You have the government acting as the final leg in the human trafficking operation being run by foreign countries' cartels. It is deeply sick stuff. Our government is doing nothing. Our country is suffering, and the GOP cannot lift a finger to communicate with the public on the scale of this issue, what levers they're going to use to shut off funding for it. And while they're enthusiastic about hauling in
Secretary Mayorkas to talk about this. They really need to be focused on Secretary Becerra of Health and Human Services, he seems perfectly tickled by this. He is not bothered in the least by what is happening in his own department under his own leadership, and Biden stands idly by. In addition to immigration policy, where the GOP really has an opportunity to differentiate themselves from the catastrophically wicked, entrenched ruling party, trade and industrial policy should be another key priority for them. So, as I said earlier in the episode, Americans are not happy with our relationship with China. They want us to rebuild our industrial capacity. They want to make things in America. They want China to stop poisoning our citizens with fentanyl. So how is this working exactly? So China manufactures the chemical components needed to make fentanyl. But instead of making fentanyl and shipping it out of their country, they send those chemicals to the Mexican cartels, where they make the fentanyl and then they traffic it to the United States. So you would think that the first thing that Biden or anyone in Congress would be concerned with when they see that fentanyl overdoses are the number one cause of death for Americans between the ages of 18 and 45, killing over 100,000 people a year, more than car crashes, suicide, many other things. You would think that they would look at where those things are coming from, which is our number one adversary in the world, China, and they would say, if you do not cease and desist with the exporting of these chemicals that are killing our citizens, we will slap tariffs that will ruin your economy immediately. This is the whole issue with people pretending that quote unquote free trade is so great for our country. Tariffs are a tool that need to be used when your country is being taken advantage of or when you need leverage over a foreign nation. And there is no greater, more urgent issue that is destroying families, destroying lives, humiliating our nation, and causing tremendous heartbreak and suffering than this fentanyl epidemic raging across every city in America right now, raging across every state and every region. And the fact that you have a tool like tariffs that Congress or the Biden administration could use at any time, and yet they don't, is just mind-boggling. It is so appalling to me that they have a tool that they could use to have leverage over this nation that is killing our citizens, and they don't use it. In a globalized world, the whole point of having trade policy is to leverage your country into a better position vis-a-vis economic relations with other countries. And so the fact that they are not using this as a tool to protect our own citizens, raises a lot of questions about where their loyalties for these politicians in Washington really lie. But it also raises questions about how committed they are to using policy to protecting the national interest. And so clearly the party that's been in power for the past 2 years, when the Democrats controlled the executive branch and the legislative branch, they had no interest in solving this problem. In fact, by all accounts, they want to make it worse because Biden, in one of his State of the Union addresses, he called for more funding for quote-unquote harm reduction policies, which are straight out of the George Soros playbook for how to destroy your nation and your civilization. In fact, I discussed this on a previous episode. I read one of George Soros's books that he authored firsthand, and he said that because he could not advocate explicitly for the legalization of all drugs, he had to pick something that was a little more palatable to the public, and that's how he decided to embrace quote-unquote harm reduction. It is literally a propaganda euphemism policy that they use to spread addiction, suffering, and death around this country. And Biden was up there on the podium in the middle of Congress at his State of the Union saying that we need more of the quote-unquote harm reduction policies. So you have an incumbent who wants to use policy to continue killing his own citizens and continue enabling another country to send the chemicals to do it. So clearly this is an issue that Republicans could have been campaigning on, that they could have been skewering Biden and the Democrats with when they were in the run-up to the election. And now, as I keep advocating, it is a policy by which they can differentiate themselves from the opposition party by doing something in the interests of the people. If they use tariffs as a bargaining chip, as a red line. So for example, if there is something that is a really high priority to Biden and the Democrats in Congress, then the Republicans should respond in kind and say, you are only getting that in this legislation if you agree to slapping catastrophic tariffs on China until they stop flooding our country with fentanyl. And if Republicans refuse to do that, then it will become apparent that no one in this country who has responsibility for the American welfare wants to end the flow of fentanyl into our country. If they suggest it and Democrats say no and don't vote for it, then you will really have something to campaign against them on in 2024, which is that they want to continue killing people with fentanyl. Bottom line is, this is the perfect opportunity to do something in the interests of the nation, to do something that saves people's lives, and to do something where if the Democrats don't want to go along with it, then it is very apparent to the public what outcome they really want, which is more Americans dying of fentanyl poisoning. So this is the type of mindset that the GOP needs to embrace. They need to think creatively about where they can get some leverage. They need to think creatively about what the problems facing our country are and how to do something about them. And this suffering will continue until you have leaders who are willing to do something about it. The Republican Party will not be a viable institution if they do not find ways to appeal to the public and develop coalitions that can win elections. And so it is so critical for them to focus on these policy interventions to differentiate themselves from the ruling party. Otherwise, you end up with more things like the $40 billion to Ukraine, where instead of enabling and facilitating and giving cover to Biden's failed strategy in Ukraine last summer when they passed that bill, they should have said, you don't get a dime until you try and fix this with diplomacy and negotiation. Because that would force Biden to own the situation, to reduce the suffering and dying in Ukraine. But instead, they just fell in line with his failed strategy and signed over more American money to cover up his embarrassing failures. So in addition to trade and immigration, which I just discussed, which are clearly such important fundamental issues to our nation's economy and to our people's welfare that have gone almost completely unaddressed by Washington for decades now, we need to focus on some serious investment in the education of our workforce. Instead of doling out all of this continued easy money to higher education institutions and so on, we should specify areas where we need a trained, skilled workforce. Paramedics, nurses, mental health professionals, geriatric care. We need real professionals by almost expanded by almost an exponential number in this country, because we are going to have more problems with addiction and substance abuse, the way the trends are going right now. So we're going to need a lot more real professionals in mental health and addiction. We're going to need real professionals in geriatric care, in nursing homes and in hospitals because of our aging population. We need a highly skilled workforce in these industries. And what the industries themselves push for often is for Congress to raise the caps on basically low wage, illiterate, cheap labor that they can just use as bodies in these industries. But what you need to actually improve the quality of care being delivered to Americans in these growing populations of people who need specialized care is a highly educated, specialized workforce. So what Congress needs to do, what Republicans need to do, is differentiate themselves from the sort of race to the bottom style lobbying that the healthcare industry does for low-wage foreign labor to fill some of these roles. And they need to say, no, we are going to create a program so that in 5 or 10 years, we have a giant core of American workers trained in these jobs in a very sophisticated, effective way. So that to me should be a key priority on the topic of education. Further, we have a big issue in this country of students who are ostensibly in school, but they are functionally illiterate. You've got some like 35% of students graduating from public schools in the 12th grade in our country who are quote unquote proficient in reading. What is happening to the other 65% of those students? Like, what can they read? when they graduate from high school if they're not quote unquote proficient by the government standards. Even a smaller percentage of them are rated proficient in math. It's 25%. So the appalling underperformance of our public schools is going to be a much bigger problem as our country tries to compete as high-tech, high-skilled industries become such a crucial lever for countries to outperform other nations globally. And you're going to have a bigger problem if we are trying to bring investment and industry and high-skilled manufacturing back to our country if we are not even graduating students literate enough to do basic types of jobs. So, as we've known for many years, the Department of Education is sort of a mess. But until we focus on outcomes for these students and get students actually achieving at a reasonable rate, we're not going to have a very promising future as a country. And you never hear this discussed in Congress. You never hear this campaigned on as an issue other than Governor Glenn Youngkin, who did it very successfully in Virginia, because education in Virginia had gone off the rails. And one of the biggest issues, they tried to make it seem as though Youngkin was campaigning only on these quote unquote cultural issues, but really what he was campaigning on in a big way to an audience of disaffected parents in his state was these basic educational failures where the government owes something to its customers, which are the tax-paying parents, and they're educating students at like a 25% success rate. So that is an issue that I think Republicans could differentiate themselves, because obviously Democrats are the party of the teachers unions, of the entrenched education bureaucracy, where these people get paid whether they do a good job or a terrible job. And so Republicans really need to, instead of bluster and silliness, they really need to focus on, and in a way, the media tries to discredit them by saying, oh, you're just focused on quote unquote cultural issues like drag queens and just trying to ban To Kill a Mockingbird for the 10th time. So what they should respond with is saying, actually, what we're concerned with is that these are all hideous distractions to what children need to be learning, in addition to being completely indecent and pornographic. But teachers and schools should not be focused on frivolousness when they're educating students at a 25% success rate. And getting Republicans focused on these substantial issues is a really key priority that would help in campaigning and would help in their perception in the public's eye. Everything I mentioned so far, I think actually has the power to be a bipartisan issue in terms of getting the public to support it. I think that they've been horrified at witnessing Biden encouraging all of this illegal immigration. They've been horrified witnessing our dependence on China. They're horrified witnessing the failures of our public schools to educate children properly. And then further, these are other issues that have been really problematic for especially Republicans voters, but could, in my mind, be popularized if the GOP dedicated any skill or energy or attention to trying to win the public over. These would be really key issues to continue differentiating themselves from the incumbent party and winning over some voters. So number one would be dealing with all of this discriminatory ideology in colleges, in hospitals, in diversity seminars, etc., where some Americans are treated like second-class citizens, even in really serious situations like health systems that say that COVID treatments and other treatments should be distributed based on race to make up for quote-unquote historic injustices and so on. These ideologically based interventions in medical schools, in hospitals, these things that they are doing that are really hurting people, hurting patients, affecting the way that doctors and other professionals who hold people's lives in their hands, they are being subverted by these sick and twisted ideologies that basically rank people and rank people's importance by race and other characteristics as a sort of method of achieving reparations for what they call historic injustices. So I did a very popular episode on this topic about wokeness in medicine that I encourage you to listen to as well. because in many cases, these policies should be illegal. They're putting people at risk, and Republicans need to be the party of making sure that Americans are treated fairly and justly, not discriminated, even in the cases where their lives are at stake in hospitals and so on. Further, these issues that have come to light, especially with the quote unquote Twitter files being released about how the intelligence community, the Department of Homeland Security spies on Americans, works with private companies to control the public discourse, even to influence elections unfairly and illegally, as well as persecuting political enemies and political causes to prevent the opposition, meaning the American public, I guess, from organizing, from their causes becoming too popular and becoming a lever by which the Republican Party can win elections. Obviously, they did this with the Tea Party. They did this with parents protesting school board corruption and malfeasance. And then the continued efforts by the intelligence community to do things like entrap destabilized loners into committing things like the Governor Whitmer quote unquote kidnapping. And it turned out that some half of the people involved in that were government agents, intelligence community operatives. These schemes and these attacks, these efforts by intelligence agencies to destabilize and radicalize already vulnerable, kind of questionable people into committing things like mass shootings. These are really serious questions of how the government is deploying its resources, even in ways where they're hurting people. So when they're so focused on punishing Americans with viewpoints they don't like, that they're not properly detecting people who are planning to commit violence or at risk of committing violence, you have a serious deviation in the government's priorities from what they should be focused on. So I really do believe that the Republicans could differentiate themselves from the Democrats by trying to get the government bureaucracies focused on what they're supposed to be delivering to the public instead of these highly corrupted, even vicious and sadistic projects where the government is basically being weaponized against the American people. And then you have an issue that no one in Washington seems to be willing to touch because there's so much corruption at these agencies like the FDA, at the DEA. I did an episode before where I went through how the DEA was so staffed up by lobbyists with its revolving door to the Washington swamp that they were not willing to crack down on the inappropriate distribution of opioid pills when they were killing people all across the country in the 2000s because these pharmaceutical lobbyists were the ones making decisions at the DEA. And they were basically corrupted to the point where they would not put an end to the inappropriately large numbers of pills being shipped to places like tiny towns in West Virginia and Kentucky and Ohio, and killing people. They refused to do something about it, even when the agents on the ground were reporting to them that these pills were being delivered in numbers that were way too high for normal medical usage. So this extends even to things like microplastics, chemicals being leached into water, chemicals being leached into people's foods, the proliferation of plastic everywhere. It's actually been shown that the presence of microplastics is such a serious problem that it is contributing to decreased sperm count and affecting female fertility. And yet no one in Washington is confronting this issue that could be addressed. I think Europe, as a matter of fact, Europe has laws dealing with some of these types of these chemicals that can be leached into people's food and water and other things they consume that actually have a measurable effect on fertility and on health, even certain cancers. So the fact that Congress has not come up with ways to pressure the FDA to get focused on how these chemicals, microplastics, and so on are poisoning the public is reflective of the deep and destructive corruption that rules the game in Washington, D.C. And I think that if Republicans could own this issue of these contaminants and these chemicals having such serious effects to where it's interfering with the public's reproductive capabilities. That's an issue that the Republicans should own and that they should popularize to the public, because if they don't do it, someday when there's enough pressure from the public, when enough people have been poisoned and there have been enough class action lawsuits, the Democrats will champion this issue if Republicans don't get to it. So this is the type of strategic thinking that not only is important to winning elections and winning over the public, but is critical to improving the national interest, improving the public's welfare. This is what the party needs to be focused on. It is really, really, really difficult to get them to address anything that matters. That is why I don't call them the party of no. They are the party of nothingness until they get serious about addressing some of these issues and winning once again. There is nothing more important than restoring recourse and representation for the American people in Washington once again. This is what I will continue to fight for, and this is what you should continue to fight for, and I do believe that we can get there someday. We need to stay focused, and we need to stay resolved, and we need our leaders to focus on these substantial policy levers to fix the dysfunction and end the extraction. Thank you so much for listening to This Is Your Country with Paige Willey. It has been a tremendous pleasure and privilege.